Wild Things, Chapter 1, Part 4. Adeline's lead foot lasted all of a minute, and then they were creeping along on poorly lit back streets, per her insistence. "Can't you drive any faster?" Lee yelled after some time. At the pace they were going, it would have been faster to walk. "Nothing can happen to this truck, Lee," Della called over her shoulder, through the mini window between the bench and the truck bed. "Ain't nothing gonna happen to the truck," Lee rolled her eyes and yelled back. "But you're the one said we gotta be back by midnight," she pointed out, and smiled as she felt the small jolt of the truck picking up speed. The sound of her voice roused Billy a bit. He reached up and pawed at the air, growling in his sleep, and mumbling something about the girls taking it easy. They'd each get their turn. Leanne bit down hard on her inner cheek to stop herself from bursting. She held her breath until Billy settled again, and she heard the light and uneven rumble of his snoring. Then she sat back, keeping one eye on him as the truck chugged along, afraid the few bumps and turns might wake him. That was all she needed for him to come to before they got where they was going. She didn't think Della had it in her to wrestle Billy down, and even with him well in his cups, Leanne knew she'd have some trouble managing him on her own. So she kept a watchful eye on him through the rest of the ride, all the way to Winfield Park, with a nervous weight in her belly, expecting he might come to any minute. But Billy had slept through the whole ride, and he hadn't given any trouble once they'd gotten to the park either. Leanne and Adeline had managed to hoist him onto a bench, square in the middle of the town center, right under the monument of Winfield Scott himself. And Billy'd given even less trouble about getting him out of his clothes, even helping the girls to get his britches down by his knees. Lordy, but Merv really wasn't going to believe this. And right in the middle of town. Billy had woken up long enough to say, smiling at the thought. Then his lids drooped under the weight of his intoxication, and his eyes went to little slits. His head fell forward, until his chin nearly rested on his chest. Billy Madison was out cold. Again. Adeline seized the opportunity and ran back to the truck to grab the ugly skirt they'd borrowed from her soon-to-be sister-in-law, Elma. "Lift his legs," she'd barked, like a woman on a mission. Leanne held up Billy's legs, while Adeline scooped the skirt up around his calves, pulling it under him and over his hips. Then Adeline produced the small canister of paint and a brush. It was just luck that they'd had some red left over from painting the shed a few weeks earlier. "I'll write it," Leanne volunteered, before Adeline could get started. Adeline hesitated, but handed Leanne the brush and the little canister anyway. "Just pig, like we said," she reminded, before she headed round the bench to work on tying down Billy's arms to it. Leanne nodded. But then she'd thought of Ray, and the way she'd cried when she'd seen her face, worried the swelling wouldn't go down in time for the wedding. And suddenly, Leanne's hands adopted a mind of their own. After a moment, she stood back and admired her handiwork. "Pig," Leanne read, "with a tiny prick. Just couldn't stick to the plan, could you?" Adeline asked. "Course not." Leanne reached down and handed over one of the pillowcases they'd brought out from the truck. "Okay," she said. "Now, swing low." Weeks later, it would be all anybody was talking about, especially Billy's eye, which looked like he'd met the hoofed end of an angry mule. But the truth was much better than that. It had actually been pillowcases filled with onions, potatoes, and other odds and ends from Leanne's uncle's farm that had given Billy the shiner, an obnoxious splotch of bluish-black, visible clear from the moon. Leanne had even put a full head of cabbage in hers. That night, to Lee's delight, Billy had woken up just before the first swing, opening his eyes just in time to see the sack coming. "What the hell?" he had began. Then he'd groaned, because Leanne had caught him right in the gut. With the cabbage, she was sure. "Oh my God!" Adeline had gasped, hearing the raw, wet retching sounds Billy had begun to make. "Christ, I can't do that." "Just do it," Lee demanded. "Nah, Lee, this ain't right." Adeline was backing away, her grip gone limp, her sack drooping in her hand. We shouldn't have. You crazy bunch of bitches. Billy grunted and spat between heaving breaths. All of you. That was all it took to halt Adeline in her retreat. She took a step back toward the bench, then another, all the while looking at Billy with his pretty face and his foul mouth. While tying down his hands, Adeline had seen the bruises still on Billy's knuckles. And she'd thought of Ray, too, her beautiful, spirited baby sister. Ray, who'd been so desperate to love this man, she'd accepted his fists and rotten temper. Ray, who hadn't left the house in a week because she said the natural light did something awful to her battered eye. But Della knew it was really that she hadn't wanted anyone to see the state of her. As if she should be the one shamed by it. Adeline remembered the feel of Ray in her arms, shaken under the strength of her sobs, the weight of her shame and devastation, and she hauled off and swung her pillowcase then, with all her might, right between Billy's legs. His eyes went the size of full $50, and he began to make a noise that neither Adeline nor Leanne had ever heard a man make. Billy yanked his hands against the ropes, straining desperately to break them, but when he realized they wouldn't come free, he pulled his knees into his chest, trying his best to curl up against the pain. He gasped, blinking back the tears stinging his bloodshot eyes, suddenly completely sober. The plan had been to take one swing each. It was Adeline who'd insisted on it. But then she felt her rage too, just as forceful and demanding, and she whacked Billy, but good, right upside his head. "No one," she yelled. "No one messes with the Pritchett sisters." Thanks for listening to this excerpt from Wild Things. This story is available on Inkit.com, Wattpad.com, and Neobook.org. Visit any of those sites to like, comment, and review. Add Wild Things to your reading list to receive notification of upcoming chapters and to learn what happens next.